Okay, it's us. What
Yes.
are we going to talk about, Adam?
I don't know, GitOps or something.
Yeah, GitOps or something. It was
It's always
DevOps until
GitOps, right?
recently. Now it's GitOps, exactly. So the general gist is to talk about. I mean, we can talk about GitOps in general, maybe give some introduction. But what sounds more interesting to me is to talk about the issues that we are facing, you're facing, others are facing, right? Kind of what is missing, what is wrong, what could be improved, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm not sure. Does it make sense? Does everybody know what is GitOps? You want to give a 2-sentence speech?
2-sentence speech. Well, I'm not sure
Okay,
if I can do
three.
2-sentence one, but yeah.
5.
Yes. So GitOps is managing your infrastructure and application deployments using Git by basically chugging all your YAML files into Git and then automatically syncing them to your cluster or to your cloud, depending on whether you're managing Kubernetes or you're managing, let's say, the cloud environment with Terraform. And doing all your changes, all your processes, everything happens around Git with pull requests and merging and history and all the good things that Git gives you.
You see,
That
we
sounds
just.
for a short intro.
I expected that you would disappoint me like 15 minutes later, not immediately, man. What, does it have to be YAML? Does it mean that I cannot use Terraform when doing GitOps?
Yeah, of course you can. It doesn't. It has to be. All right, let's be very scientific. There has to be declarative configuration, right?
No Pulumi?
Sorry?
No Pulumi?
Okay, no idea.
I'm picking on you, man.
You can, because I have no clue what Pulumi is. I'm not getting the joke.
Pulumi is like a way to define infrastructure as code instead of declarative syntax. But it's a bad joke. Doesn't matter. Okay, so
I would like to look into that.
Yeah, it's kind of like, write Go or Java or Python or whatever you like and accomplish the same result as using Terraform, let's say, or Ansible or whatever.
That part is, I actually have like slightly seen Pulumi, but I'm like wondering about how does that relate to GitOps then, and I have no clue. But like, I would have to look more into it, but it's an interesting question.
From my perspective, GitOps is, I tend to define it a bit in a more general way. Mm-hmm. It's about everything being defined as code, and bear in mind that I count YAML as code, right? Everything defined as code is stored in Git. Git is the only source of truth of the desired state, and then we have some processes, machines, whatever, that is converging that into the actual state, right?
That's I think there is nothing wrong with that definition, really, but I tend to I like to say that it's the infrastructure part of things is in its own repo, especially for like first of all, the important thing is that there is GitOps for infrastructure and GitOps for application release management deployment, right? These are pretty much two things, very similar. Both are really GitOps, but actually for infrastructure management, it's a pretty much of a no-brainer to do GitOps, right? Like people have been doing that even with Puppet or whatever to put it into Git. Of course, you put it into Git. With application release management, it's a less used. It's. I think that's more the new thing, and that's also where WeWork started doing it, right? That with Kubernetes, you have your Kubernetes YAMLs, which is not really infrastructure. It's really defining applications and what version of the application is running and so on, and put that into Git, and put that into not the repo where the source code lives, but have a separate repo where you are managing, basically you're doing your application release management. You're saying what needs to be deployed to what environment, and you say this in Git. And that is, I think, You can broaden the definition of GitOps, but I think this is the most useful definition of GitOps, where it kind of distinguishes it from like everything else that you do in Git.
Yeah. Sound fair enough.
Okay, I thought you'd fight me on that, but okay.
No, I mean, so from my perspective, I think that what Weaveworks or whomever came up with the term GitOps accomplished is not really to define something that didn't exist. In my head, some teams were doing GitOps like for 20 years, even before there was Git, right? You store the state definition of something in Git, and then Git is your source of truth, and you converge that state one way or another, right? It could be CI/CD pipelines, it could be your build scripts, it could be your Java code, it could be, I don't know, CF engine. Probably nobody even heard about that. CF engine definition of infrastructure, like long before Chef and Puppet. So principles were there, I think, for forever, from version control, right? The major, I think, accomplishment that we got from discovering, let's say, inventing the term itself, not the practice, is that we finally have a name for something that we were all throwing around, and we got interest to actually work on that as industry and try to figure out what would be the best way to do it, instead of random teams in random places trying to figure out all the same patterns and practices and what's or not, right? Like what you were mentioning about repositories. Yeah, does it make more sense to do, I don't know, like repositories or branches or monorep or what's or not, right? It made us think, I think, rather than invent something
and
revolutionary.
Yeah, I agree. It was something that people have been doing before. On the other hand, for application release management, it was not really a common practice before to put that into Git. That's
exactly
new. It was your like Jenkins pipelines, like pipeline number 27 has deployed application version 123, and that was pretty much it. That ended with the deployment, and it was done. This was not launched because you committed the application version into Git.
Or even, in my experience, in many cases it was, but still, like 95% of, let's say, application definition was in Git. But then those 5%, which are actually the critical 5%, were not, because in your pipeline you would put, hey, this is my, I don't know, like this is my Helm definition, it's in Git, but I'm going to execute from a pipeline kubectl blah 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 set tag to 57, right? And that's the critical piece. That's kind of the piece I need the most to having it and clearly visible and traceable and all those things. So kind of those 5% were really bugging me.
Exactly. I think it's the release management part that was not happening in Git before.
Yes.
At least not with let's say applications that get continuously deployed. Like, of course, we knew how to do release management with libraries, for example, that get consumed by third parties and stuff. But with applications that are just like in a continuous delivery pipeline, my own company's applications that just keep flowing to production and we are releasing all the time, that stuff was not really common thing to manage in Git. A lot of times, actually, this GitOps actually sometimes replaces like crappy systems, like just simple Jenkins pipelines doing this. Sometimes it replaces actually more elaborate systems that are like, let's say something like XR release that does a lot of stuff, and like with big pipelines and whatever. And GitOps is like can actually replicate a lot of this functionality, but much simpler, and basically connecting just like simpler tools together instead of having like a big machinery to do this.
And it gives, I think that we are for the first time on the edge of having traceability of everything in one place, right? If you use XLR, right, XL deploy or whatever is the name, right? I remember when I was kind of working as engineer and stuff like that, for me that was black box, black magic, right? Kind of, hey, somebody deployed, I have no idea. That's what's going on. Now, to be honest, most of the time I didn't care. But if I did care, I could never find out what's going on, really.
Yeah, but then comes, of course, if we jump into a bit the problems with GitOps is that you're saying we're on the brink of making everything traceable. However, GitOps doesn't cover all the cases, right? One very important case is just the most simple one is Kubernetes rolling upgrades. So you can put your desired version of your application into Git as a Kubernetes YAML deployment resource. You change the version, Kubernetes starts upgrading it, or you of course you first sync the YAML to the cluster. Kubernetes starts the rolling upgrade process. It fails somewhere halfway because your pods are not coming up. Your application is still nice and running because Kubernetes is managing this process to roll it back and whatever. However, this is not this new transitionary state is not captured in Git. So now you have your source of truth kinda about your current state and what's going on in between. Git only has the intended state and cannot handle this kind of fine-grained process where things are changing every second, how many replicas are coming up and so on.
But when you say it cannot handle, do you mean that it cannot handle, it shouldn't handle, or the tooling we have right now is simply did not think about it?
It's a good question. For me, of course, we could have a tool that just, I don't know, commits this stuff into Git or whatever, but kind of feels like it is not really good for this stuff, right? Like for frequent programmatic updates it's heavyweight. To make a Git commit is a thing, while a slight change in the number of active replicas in Kubernetes is something that happens maybe multiple times a second. So to try to somehow get this into Git, I'm not sure. I don't feel like that's a good idea.
But to me, that's kind of, I think that those two examples are very different. Like if you talk about active number of replicas, really the desired state, at least when I'm defining it, I'm not really defining desired state as 7 replicas. I'm defining desired state as, hey, anything between 3 and 75, or whatever the range is for my use case, is my desired state. So we might now argue whether that's the right way to define it or no, but at least based on the current practice, my personal practice, I'm not defining the number of replicas. Like if you're talking about Kubernetes, I'm defining horizontal pod autoscaler, which has a range of replicas, right? So to me, it's much worse is the rollback situation that you mentioned before, because that is something that I am actively defining. Like every single time I do a release, I define a new tag, right? No matter now what is happening in the cluster, I'm doing that, right? Or my pipelines are doing, either me or a machine that I instructed to do is doing it. Now, in that context, when let's say Flagger or Argo CD or any of the similar, or Argo rollouts or any of the similar tools, when they roll back, then to me that is really messing up with the whole concept. That puts a lot of danger on the system because, I don't know, maybe somebody is going to commit something to the same environment repo, maybe not even related to that application, and then that will kick up a process that will try to go back to the new release that I just rolled back. It's a disastrous scenario. And I'm going to let you talk in a second, sorry. And
no, go ahead. This is exactly, yeah.
That specific rollback situation, for example, is not even something that is happening like every 3 seconds, right? It's not happening all the time. We are trying to make it never happen. It happens sometimes. And for me, those tools that I mentioned, making a commit, I don't see it as a big deal. Even if they're going to perform the rollback themselves without letting other tools do the thing because they're in charge, even in that case, still, it's a simple commit. It's not that big deal. Why not?
You mean the tool doing the rollback actually making a commit to Git and like changing back the version?
Yes, or delegating to some other process, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's bundled or yes.
You're right, because actually you wouldn't do that like during the whole rollout process, but you would just do it at the end when it has completely and utterly failed, and you completely roll back to the old version. And then actually a commit in Git will signify to everybody that, hey, look, the intended state is now the old version, simply because the new version doesn't start for some reason. And it could put that into a commit message. And yeah, okay, you changed my mind on that then.
The more complicated situations where I'm not clear are intermediate steps, and for them I really don't have strong need to be GitOps. Like if you stick with rolling forward, canaries, whatever, right? Kind of, I'm going to roll out 20%. I don't need that in Git because the desired state is really to get to 100.
Yeah.
This is just a process, takes time, that's understandable. I don't need intermediary steps, but I think that we have a serious need as industry to have those final states, whatever the desired states are.
Yeah, and I see somebody in the comments mentioning we should give this a name to this problem where Git no longer represents what's in the cluster. I agree. This would be actually cool to name these things. I'm not good at naming things. Let's try to think of something.
No, look, if
anybody has a suggestion in the chat, please go ahead.
The fact that I'm working for a company and not having my own company just proves that I'm incapable to come up with a catchy name. Because that's kind of half of success, right? Kind of like if you can name a new term in the industry, you're golden.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Somebody's asking if like Jenkins versus GitOps. Yeah, it's not mutually exclusive. It's more like with GitOps, your primary source of you would start a deployment by making a change to a Git repo, and that maybe kicks off a Jenkins pipeline that syncs that version to the cluster. But like you're not starting a Jenkins pipeline by typing in the version you want to deploy. Say Jenkins is a flexible tool, so you can do many things with Jenkins. But I think the anti-pattern to GitOps would be a Jenkins pipeline where you actually like have to enter the version you want to deploy as a parameter, and it's not captured anywhere in Git what's the currently deployed version.
Pipeline tools like Jenkins and others, I think that they should all do a big favor to the industry if they would actually remove any button that allows anybody to ever execute any pipeline build. If anybody can do that, would get my blessing. Kind of like I don't know, I would freak out if that would be possible.
You mean not allowing like adding parameters for the builds?
No, not even parameters for the builds. No.
Yeah, only launching based on Git changes, right?
Yeah, based on Git changes, because it's always a Git change. If it's not a change in Git, to me that's always a smell of something being done terribly wrong. Like, I need to have a button to rerun the build because sometimes my tests are failing because they're flaky. Now, the solution to that is not to have a button. The solution for that is to remove flaky tests. That's the solution. Button is just like aspirin that takes down your fever, but does not cure you really, right?
Yeah. What does Codefresh do, by the way? Does Codefresh have buttons?
We have buttons. I've been in Codefresh for only 2 months. I didn't have enough time to convince Codefresh to remove all the buttons. I'm actively working on it.
Yeah. But I know that the simple online tools like Circle CI, I think like they only do things based on Git or GitHub Action.
No, you can rerun unless something changed, or unless I'm mixing it with Travis, you can rerun a build like 50,000 times.
Yeah, okay. Like I like rerunning builds. I have found it a terrible hassle when I can't rerun.
Covered.
Yeah, then making the fake commits, right? So you can like commit named launching pipeline again. Add the space here. Anyways, we're digressing from GitOps.
Yeah. So what else? I'm kind of disappointed that I did a while ago did a quick search for in Google. That's where you search, right? For definitions of GitOps, just to see how much they differ from. And I got surprised that so many of the most common definitions, they all have the word Kubernetes in them. And to me, that is misleading. Option A, misleading. Option B, marketing stunt. Option C, short-sighted. Do you have option D?
No, but however, I do know how things. I think the marketing stunt category happens because I have it a lot of times that I just have to simplify things. Many times in the start of my blog post, I just say like, we narrow it down. This is going to be about Kubernetes. I know that there is the whole world outside of that, but there is no space to talk about that, especially conference talks and stuff. So that happens.
Serverless gets you to every single conference.
Yeah, that's true. And machine learning, yeah.
And machine learning and AI.
Yeah, machine learning with GitOps would be probably a very hit top for the next 5 years. But there is something about Kubernetes because I think GitOps gets really interesting when you start managing application deployments with it. When you're just managing infrastructure with stuff in Git, that's just a no-brainer because it doesn't change that often, and there is no like CI pipeline building the packages, the binaries before, and then having to like where do I, because this is the GitOps on Kubernetes is really about like I have built my application and now the management of getting that application onto different environments. And with things like Terraform, there is the code, and then I update and then I apply it to the environment. There isn't this the complexity is less than with managing application releases, and also it doesn't replace anything. With Terraform, you have always put Terraform files into Git and then apply them to clusters. Maybe with GitOps you would want to automate the apply part, like you don't want a manual a manual step there to review and whatever, but even that's questionable. So that doesn't feel to me like it's a step forward. But with GitOps for application releases, which theoretically again doesn't have to be Kubernetes, but yeah, it just is 90% of the time, then yeah, that's where it really changes things compared to how things have been done before. So yeah, from like a scientific perspective or whatever, like a formal perspective, if you try to define GitOps, it will certainly encompass Terraform and all these. But when I try to talk about the interesting parts, then it usually boils down to Kubernetes and application release management.
But they're essentially very similar, right? That, like, if you use, let's say, Terraform with infrastructure, you put Terraform definition. If you use Helm with applications, you put Helm definitions in Git. You have something that applies them, whatever that something is. So they're the same. They're pretty much the same thing, except, and this is now probably something you don't care about, but that I'm surprised that we do not talk about all the things happening before and after the simple deployment part, that much about infrastructure, right? Kind of, because if you're talking about applications, if I tell you, hey, Adam, everything you need is to put some Helm definition somewhere and then some tool will apply it, you would say you're insane because you need to deploy it to some environment. You need to run some tests and then you need to deploy it somewhere else. And then you need to run some other tests. And in between those things, you need to do a bunch of stuff. And all that stuff equally applies to infrastructure. Except that we are not maybe so mature as industry to take it for granted that it applies.
Yes. And while you were talking, I was thinking, and actually this is the first time I had this thought, is that GitOps may be is also related a bit to microservices, in the sense that usually this is what people working with non-compiled languages do. They many times like they don't need all this compilation and like this kind of stuff. They are what I see is usually, let's say, Node.js teams have this branching model where you have your production branch for your code, and you have your test environment branch for your code, and your development environment branch for your code, and basically you just have something on your development environment branch, and that gets deployed to your development environment, because basically there is no compilation, you don't need to build anything. You can just like basically grab the code and then download it to a server. That's how it was done before. Now they're trying to build Docker images with the same branching strategy, which is, I think, a bit more icky. However, you can get away with this. This is fine. If you look at it just from a single services point of view, this is great. You don't need all this intermediary bullshit of like building a Docker image and then in another Git repo making a change. In another Git repo, you say that Docker image I just built from this Git repo now needs to be deployed to that environment. That's like whole extra useless complexity, as long as you have one single service. However, when you have like 10 services going to the development environment that kind of need to interact and so on, suddenly you have a hell of these branches, because now what's on the development branch of all the single services gets really messy. So suddenly GitOps becomes much better, because you have built your images out of all those services, and now in your GitOps repo you can say my development environment looks like this. I have version the X of this service, version Y of this service, and just describe my whole development environment. This starts to make sense once you have a whole bunch of services. So maybe the move to microservices, which of course is tightly related to Kubernetes, has made GitOps more important and more appealing than it was before, when you really had, like, let's say if you have a Node.js monolith, you can really just like download the code from Git to your server. You don't even need a Docker image out of it.
So I agree that microservices made that, I mean, it's a chicken and egg. Microservices, cloud, Kubernetes, containers, all those things combined somehow made it the right moment, I think, to talk about those things, because suddenly we have a stronger foothold in declarative ways to define things and stuff. But the use cases that you're describing, they hardly ever exist. It doesn't matter, like if it's a monolith or a microservice, I'm yet to find a serious company, meaning that more than 50 people company that doesn't have plethora of applications, right? There is at least 5 applications, always. Kind of like there is, even if it's a single application, there is still Nginx running somewhere, and there is a database running somewhere else, and so on and so forth. So it's never that one application scenario. And if there is, like in my hobby projects, right, kind of like, then I don't even know that, I mean, in those scenarios, those branches that you mentioned are completely unnecessary. Why do I need those? I don't need, my hobby sites, I commit, I push directly to the master, I execute from my terminal. I'm fan of gcloud run now, kind of gcloud run. And I don't know, something happens. It just happens to be alive, right?
I don't know how productive it is to like talk about like how many companies do this or don't do this. I see plenty do this. Well, because of the fact that you have Nginx and stuff running somewhere, but those sometimes you manage even manually or whatever. Like, of course, the good way to do them is GitOps. But if you have those types of companies, and then there's a lot of those who like built one big monolith, and all your processes are around the big monolith, and the rest is just whatever. The rest might be deployed manually, the rest might be done somehow, but all the focus is actually on deploying that big monolith. And in that case, this branching strategy makes sense.
Yeah.
I had a very hard time sometimes describing GitOps to people, unless when they already try to go to many services, and then they still try to apply this strategy, and they try to build Docker images out of the different branches of their source code. Then yeah, then they really appreciated GitOps.
That's true. You need to understand and experience the pain that something is solving. If you don't, then that solution.
Yeah.
That reminds me. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I forgot to circle back on this, because originally where this idea came from was that you mentioned that it's all like you all need to do all these things with infrastructure too, right? And this is, I think, where again infrastructure is a bit different. Yes, you need to test it. Yes, you need to run tests and whatever. However, the step where you get your how you test your infrastructure definitions is basically changing them in Git and then applying to them to a test environment, and then testing them. There is this whole management of the source code. There is no such thing. You just have your YAML files basically. You don't have two things. You don't have two things like with the applications. You have the source code repos on one hand, then you have like the environment state definition, and then the real environment. Out of these three, with infrastructure, you only have two. That's why it becomes simpler and more straightforward, basically, to do GitOps with infrastructure.
And what are tests in that scenario?
Well, then you would run tests after you have applied it to a test environment. So you don't have like the CI style tests. You don't have unit tests.
Why? I mean, kind of.
Yeah, okay, you can have them. You can have them. Most people.
I mean, right? Like, kind of. Let's say that and it doesn't have to be anything new, anything special. Let's say that I have some integration test, something. Let's say that runs in 15 minutes. Doesn't have to be longer, right? For some application, whatever, right? Now, if I would want to change I would actually say that for infrastructure we do everything plus. If I want to try upgrading my infra, let's say Kubernetes cluster, I'm going to spin up a new cluster, small one, right? I don't need the same size. I'm going to deploy all or some of the applications that run in my production, right? I would upgrade that, and then comes Terraform. I would upgrade that Terraform, use Terraform to upgrade my cluster, and then that would run the same test that I'm running when I'm deploying my apps. Basically, so what I'm trying to say is that I see like the part of the life cycle of an environment, maybe not the single application. Like what do you do when you upgrade an application? Yeah, I don't know, you do this and that. There are like 5, 50 or whatever the number of steps. For infrastructure, it's exactly the same, plus upgrade of the infrastructure. And now, it's a lot of, you might be thinking, it's a lot of work, but I would argue it's not, because actually it's hooking the existing processes into the process of infrastructure.
Okay. Yes. And there's nothing wrong with what you're saying. I still need to, like, I don't know, do some whiteboarding on this or something, because there is a difference how these processes pan out in the end. In the end, these infrastructure upgrade and test processes are not the same. Like you like, for example, with infrastructure, you can't bottle it up in a Docker container. You can't have this image thing like with where the CI process, the build process of your application neatly ends with a Docker image, and then you have this whole nice separation of the Docker image is done, and now I'm in another phase of the whole thing where I'm deploying it to some environment, running some tests against it, deploying it to another environment, deploying it to production, etc. This separation you can't have with infrastructure. You actually need to make changes to real things. There is no way to like encompass the infrastructure in a Docker image and just like run tests on it or whatever. It's a more destructive process, or like more you have to actually speak to Kubernetes cluster and so on, which becomes more heavyweight. It's slower. In the end, it becomes a different thing. It's not that somehow. Yeah. Anyways, I think this goes a bit too deep to like really untie this knot now, whether it's really different to do infrastructure with GitOps or not. I would say at least in how it in like 80% of the cases how this pans out, really how these processes look like in the end, it is different is it theoretically different? Probably not. Probably you're totally right about that. But in practice, these processes kind of end up looking quite different. The application process and the infrastructure release process.
Oh yeah. No. My reality always, whenever one of my theories faces reality, it always loses. Always. I haven't had a single win so far. So
that's an interesting like tech philosophical question of like of course nobody ever does that thing that's in the book and in the conference talk and whatever. It's but are those still useful ideas to have, to strive to? We have kind of like rather these like ideals, like like I don't know, like Buddhism, like the nirvana state, where of course nobody really goes there, but like but it's nice to have to like to aspire and try to go that way.
But on the other hand, those ideas very often do become reality. Like I remember a long time ago, I remember some of the conversations about immutability. That was before VMs, right? And the reaction was, yeah, this is insane. Kind of like, of course it's insane. It's impossible, right? Kind of like, stupid theory. And then we got VMs, and then those conversations started again. And kind of like, yeah, now it's a bit more possible, but it's still stupid. It's still silly, kind of. And then we got containers, and now it's possible. But my applications, no, it's still silly, right? And now we are finally getting there. Yes, it's we have the technology, we have the ideas, we have the processes, and your applications are not so horrible as they were like 10 years ago, right? Things need to collide. The universe, the stars, everything needs to collide somehow, and it does eventually, maybe.
Yeah.
So how about? One of the things that I believe many people are struggling, and I see that also through questions, and that is how to plug, let's say, GitOps style of deployments. I'm gonna now limit to deployments, GitOps style deployments into continuous something pipelines. Right? I even hear often people saying, okay, so why is GitOps better than CD, or should I use pipelines or Argo CD and before I say it's silly, I want to see what you think.
Well, I've done continuous delivery with GitOps in a way where there was a like variable number of environments, practically 4, like development, integration, then like pre-production and production environment. And we actually made like a continuous delivery pipeline that deployed to each of these environments in order. And basically it was a Jenkins pipeline. So one single pipeline that tries to push your application through all these stages all the way to production. Now, the problem with that is that on one hand, and this was done with GitOps, which meant that this pipeline was not launched because there was a change in Git. In the basically, in one of those GitOps, there was for every environment there was a corresponding GitOps repo, and this pipeline was writing to the GitOps repo, basically instructing the environment to be updated with that version of the application. Once the application came up, tests were run against it, and then the pipeline commenced to deploy the application to the next environment. So basically, we really drew up the classic continuous delivery, pipeline with a real Jenkins pipeline. The problem with this is that whoever has this many environments is already thinking too much control for continuous delivery. So basically, this pipeline sometimes ran for a week because it had to stop for lots of manual testing, of course, somebody who has the development and then the integration environment and then the pre-production environment and then the production environment. That's a lot of environments because people are afraid and want to control things and whatever, that's not the people who want to really deploy an application like 3 times to production a day. So yeah, so this long running pipeline problem, it is a problem. But then the alternative to this is to basically either edit those Git repos manually, or not have that many environments, or I'm not really sure. Like there is a lot of options here, but all feel to have like all kinds of downsides. What's your take on that, Victor? How would you do like continuous delivery with GitOps?
I mean, I don't have a clear answer, to be honest, yet. But few of the questions I'm having is to begin with, if you're moving towards, microservices, distributed this and that and all that stuff, maybe one of the problems that you are facing is trying to describe everything as a single pipeline. Maybe actually the better direction would be that we have, I don't know, anything between 1 and 1 million pipeline builds that are triggered on certain events, right? And that event could be, hey, build A pushes something to staging environment and then stops, and then build B is triggered when I merge that something to the master run. I'm inventing now use case, right? Or maybe build C is triggered when let's say that you want to deploy GitOps style and test afterwards. Just a simple example, right? Maybe the solution is not to have a pipeline that modifies Git repo to deploy and then waits until monitors it with kubectl watch, right? But kind of shut down, and then some other pipeline will be executed when Argo CD, let's say, or Flux sends a trigger.
Yeah.
So
actually, that's
maybe
I don't know why didn't we do it that way. I know why we didn't do it that way. Why we try to do it with a single pipeline? Because actually we had to make the pipeline stop and wait until the application comes up. So we had to, in the Jenkins pipeline, basically have this push button step, but we pushed the button using the API. When the application came up, we made a call back into Jenkins and pushed the button through the Jenkins API, which already is a pretty harebrained solution. But what we did have was a proper continuous delivery view of the whole pipeline, which if you break up this pipeline into 4 pieces, then you only see that, so staging environment has been deployed for some reason. You don't see the overall picture of this unified picture. And I think the tool that has continuous delivery in its name,
half of the tools in the industry today.
No, they were in the description, but not something CD, something CD.
Argo CD?
Yeah, no.
Flux CD?
No. Yeah, you're right. These all have it, but I don't think these are actually continuous delivery tools. Never mind. But they have this pipeline aggregation view of aggregating multiple pipelines, which Jenkins does.
But that's maybe the pipelines might be facing the same problems as systems were facing or still facing with microservices. So if I have now a system that has any number of microservices, that's great, but I do need to understand what that system is. I need to understand what is production, right? And GitOps in a way tries to somehow solve that. Say, hey, go to this repo and you will see those 57 applications, what is being deployed, right? Now, and I know that there were people in the past saying, hey, I'm never going to go to microservices because simply I will never manage to have that type of observability, but we are getting there. And maybe we are missing that for pipelines. I'm thinking aloud now, this is not prepared, but maybe the real solution is to have kind of events-based pipelines, and the missing piece is to actually still give me a visibility into what is my pipeline. So I need to understand the life cycle of an application, but for me to understand life cycle of an application from beginning to the end, I do not necessarily need, the solution is not to have one definition of a life cycle, one pipeline. It's rather that the problem is that if I have more than one, then there are no tools that give me visibility into how those interact. Maybe that's something similar to the problem that tracing was facing with microservices, right? Tracing was conceptually a nightmare until we got tools that can tell me, hey, it's okay if you have 50 applications because I can show you how the request travels across all of them, right? Maybe that's something that we need.
Yeah, and it's not that hard to do, actually. By the way, the tool I was talking about is GoCD.
GoCD, okay.
GoCD has something like that. Also, when I had spent a little time trying it, and it didn't feel like it lived up to what's written in the features list. But yeah, but it's not that hard. Like, you have a few pipelines, and probably the tool can't discover that these pipelines are connected because, let's say, the event that triggers the next pipeline is something external, right? So you're not triggering the next pipeline because the previous one finished, but you're triggering the next one because your application has started up and the tests were successful or whatever. Or like, probably the test would be run from the pipeline. So just that's your application started up. So now your next pipeline can run. So yeah, that means that you would have external events. The tool couldn't discover that your pipelines are connected, but you could just tell that to the tool that, like, yeah, I have these 4 pipelines and they're actually coming one after the other, and please just put them next to each other on the same screen so I can see. That's it. I don't really need more than that. Yeah, so event-based CI/CD, I think it's also a topic that gets mentioned from time to time. I haven't seen any like really good implementation of it, but it's not hard to imagine getting this right.
Yeah, I mean, actually, as a matter of fact, from technical perspective, I still think that kind of visibility is missing because event-based, you can configure. I mean, I know that in Codefresh we do that forever, but in every other tool as well, nothing prevents us from configuring. I'm using Jenkins because you mentioned it. Jenkins to actually trigger 5 pipeline builds at different stages, right? It's a simple trigger. That's not really a problem. It's just that then I lose control of what really my process is.
Yeah.
And
by the way, we have some questions here.
Yeah.
The good practice. Sorry.
Terin, can you maybe put Matthew's question? What are good practices on the screen? Hey.
Oh wow, that's nice.
Okay, go, Sandor. Adam.
Yes. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't worked with Terraform Cloud, so I think it's well, generally for GitOps, I think it's one of the like rules of GitOps should be there is no manual confirmation after you merge to Git. No,
I mean, merge is the manual confirmation, right? Kind of, and I think that's. I see people not related with infra more often in conversations with applications, kind of that almost problem. How am I gonna confirm something? I need to confirm. Okay, merge is a confirmation. No, I need a different type of confirmation. Yeah. To me, pull requests are the best way to approve something. I cannot imagine a better way.
Yeah, and probably the output of Terraform plan should already be in the comments of the pull request, and then you merge
exactly.
That. And if Terraform Cloud doesn't allow you to do it, kind of sounds to me from the way the question is phrased.
Go away.
A good way to prevent drift is to just not have any manual steps after the merge, because then it just becomes just a storage of things, right? It just becomes like you have no idea whether that thing actually happened. But generally, by the way, this is a topic in GitOps, more a problem in GitOps, more general, the drift of the environment, because we are dealing with tools like Kubernetes, where it's kind of natural that people go into the cluster and can make changes to it, even without by going around Git. So what if there is a manual change? Yeah, what if the application doesn't actually start up? And these kind of things, and that's this kind of environmental drift is good to monitor, and tools actually do that, like Flux and Argo CD. They monitor drift and can alert on that. But that doesn't work for Terraform. So for Terraform, I guess you'd have to like run plan over again and like make sure there is 0 changes or something like that.
But even if Argo CD and Flux do monitor for drifts, and when I say drift in this context, I don't mean intentional drift. I intentionally change the desired state, but
Yep.
randomly something changed to the. I think that even that is kind of silly. I believe that the whole GitOps idea falls apart unless you have a segment of your system. Doesn't have to be the whole system, but isolated segment of the system that is untouchable. The moment you start mixing manual operations with Git, I wouldn't discard the option to come to the conclusion that it's better off without GitOps. It needs to be, this cannot be touched. Otherwise, it becomes almost pointless. And when I say it cannot be touched, I mean accepting, there are always special circumstances. I understand that, but special circumstances that we are hoping never to reach type of stuff, right? And I understand that for almost everybody, right? It's close to impossible to reach to the state in which you do not touch any part of the live system, but as a whole, right? That's very hard to get. But we can always say, okay, I don't know, like this namespace is untouchable. You can do your shenanigans somewhere else, but this namespace, no.
Yeah, and I would like to. I see there is only one more question and that's about CodeShip problems. So I wouldn't go into that today. That doesn't seem GitOps related. One more problem I find very interesting that GitOps makes your basically CI/CD pipeline into a distributed system in the sense that it completely segregates the image building part from the deployment part. Do you get it? What I'm getting at, Viktor? Like with basically you build your image, then you make a change to Git to make sure that image gets deployed, right? And then there is a sync process that syncs Git to the console.
Exactly.
So that means basically your CI pipeline or whatever you call your pipeline cannot end on a note that deployment has been successful. It ends on a note that maybe your pipeline can automatically make a change to Git, right?
Exactly.
Like build the image 1.2.3 and make the change to Git to deploy image 1.2.3. So that's your automated deployment. However, when you just look at your CI tool and you look at your pipeline being nice and green, all you know that your pipeline has successfully made a change to Git. You don't get this feedback like you used to have when you didn't have Git there in the middle of this process, when your pipeline would have ended with kubectl apply and maybe watching a deployment come up, then you knew that the application came up. Now you have lost that because you are separated completely from the cluster. You're only talking to Git.
Yes.
So very interesting. I find this very interesting. This problem with GitOps. Actually, having a distributed system is good, also for stability, because you can even have your Kubernetes cluster down at the moment of your trying to change the environment. You will make a change to Git, and someday some operator will make that happen. However, for developers in a day-to-day workflow, this kind of sucks because they would like to know, okay, is this done already?
But that's I think that's the reason why I was mentioning before that maybe we should be breaking those pipelines. I've seen one solution to the problem, which is horrible, and I really encourage nobody to do it, and that is, hey, my pipeline is going to change Git and then execute Argo CD up sync or sync up or whatever is the command, right? Which to me is silly because I just managed to actually have no access to a cluster until that point. So anyways, but if Argo CD or Flux can notify me, then the problem is solved. We need to kind of start thinking about event-driven stuff, right? There is an event. This application is initialized. This application is deployed. This application is healthy, right? Those are all the events that we all know. They're in Kubernetes, right?
Yes.
Now, what is kind of missing, I think, is that we are not necessarily used to actually capture those events and do something about them.
Exactly, and this is what we were thinking about when to have an event bus basically about releases happening and so on. So let's say your CI pipeline can listen to that and stop and wait until the event comes in, and let's say timeout after 10 minutes and things like that. So have an intermediate, and that would probably help also with the canary release rollouts and so on. That tools, your monitoring tools and whatever could listen to it and deal with these, and they would be a bit higher level events than Kubernetes events. You wouldn't do this with Kubernetes. You wouldn't.
No.
Kubernetes events. You would broadcast like more business, not really business events, but application related. Yeah.
It needs to be more specific because Kubernetes events would just be overwhelming. I was more referring to Kubernetes as if those events exist in a system.
Yeah.
What we are missing is to have a process that decides which events are worth sending notifications for.
Yeah.
Right? Whatever those are. It would probably be some kind of CRD that we configure and say, hey, application A is interested when it's healthy. Application B is interested when it's pending for 5 minutes. Stuff like that.
Yeah, and this could go into Kafka or RabbitMQ or whatever, and then anybody in the wider system could listen to these events.
Exactly. And then if we do that, kind of like that would solve that problem of things in a cluster happening without Git being reflected in Git in a way. It would solve the problem of monolithic pipelines. It would solve actually quite a lot of problems.
It would indeed, yeah.
Should we make a startup? Work on it?
I guess we will have to. Yeah. Which too many people heard it.
Yeah. No, it's a horrible idea. Horrible. Whomever is listening, it's a horrible idea. Don't do it.
Yeah, it's also nice because it would still keep the spirit of GitOps. If we would have what we would need here really is, we don't even need the event management, the event bus kind of thing, because that can be Kafka or RabbitMQ or whatever. You need the emitter of the events. So something that sits on Kubernetes and translates what's happening into meaningful events. And you don't even need CRDs to specify who's interested in what. You can just like keep pushing all the events, and then whoever is listening, wants to listen, can listen to them. The only thing, like in a large scale setup, like the one I was working on, GitOps was really good because of all kinds of many data centers and firewall rules and whatever. And it was a good thing that only Git needed to be a thing that everybody can reach from everywhere. So that was even doing WebSockets was difficult on some environments because you were not supposed to call into the environment, only pull things from the environment. But I guess, you could add to Git, you could add like one central Kafka RabbitMQ thing, and then run an agent on all the Kubernetes clusters, and all these release deployment events could be pushed into this central Kafka RabbitMQ, and then just keep your CI pipelines can be triggered based on these. That would be pretty awesome.
Yeah, I mean,
plus the CI to support like easily hooking up to these events, and not like with some horrible adapter logic that you somehow have to hack in.
Yeah, I mean, that same bus could be listened by some other entity and do the change to Git. I don't expect Flagger or Argo rollouts to actually do the change in Git that we did. Just announce it.
Yeah. The beauty of GitOps is, what I really like about GitOps is that it's actually that you have to put together multiple tools to make this work. I'm terrified of the idea of a GitOps tool that would like do actually Jenkins X is kind of that. It's nice, but it's a nice thing to start with. But it's in a large scale deployment time, especially when like people or a company has opinions on a certain tool. They want Argo CD. But I'm super happy that they don't tell me what CI tool do. Or all these pieces can be put together. So I would really like an agent that runs on Kubernetes and emits events, and it's not Argo CD that does it. It's not like a one-size-fits-all solution.
You know what's my main beef with Argo CD? The name. It cannot have. I'm really disappointed that there is a CD in the name. Kind of like that's my major complaint about Argo CD. Why did you have to call yourself CD? You're not bloody CD.
Yeah.
Brilliant deployment mechanism.
Yeah.
Amazing tool, right?
Yeah. It's a sync tool basically. That's it.
Yeah. A deployment mechanism based on Git, whatever.
Yeah,
right?
something. Yeah.
Okay, so I think that we are over time. We could continue for at least 3 hours, right? But maybe we should close up.
Maybe we should.
Before we offend too many people. Any closing thoughts, Adam?
Yeah, not really. I think we covered the most interesting ones. Like I recently wrote a blog post about like the downsides of GitOps. Yeah, because that's what we base the title on, the bad and the ugly. And yeah, most of the things there actually have like quite straightforward solutions. They're more like things people run into. I think the ones we discussed today were the ones that are like the cool problems that don't have like a very straightforward solution. That's yeah.
And if I may stress, kind of most of the issues I think that we talked about are the issues that did not really exist for majority of people until recently. It's just that we're progressing, kind of like who cared about the drift 10 years ago? Kind of almost nobody, right? And then once we solve those, then we will be talking how some next set of problem is really shitty.
Yeah, exactly. Like how easy it is to do rolling upgrades on Kubernetes. It's amazing. Like 5 years ago, it was like a big deal to do rolling upgrades. Yeah, now it's now we get it out of the box and don't even think about them. Yeah, it's we're making good progress. I'm wondering whether GitOps will be at some point either boxed into some bigger tool that is like where it's where it's just like an internal detail that actually there is Git to manage things, or whether it would like be again like tools like Excel release would make a comeback and and say like we just like to have a tool that does it all because that's nice, because it is a hassle to cobble together all these tools to make a GitOps system.
I think it really depends on how you define it. If you limit yourself to maybe only the deployment process, that yes, what you just said make a lot of sense. But if you see GitOps as a set of wider principles, I would rather hope actually, that the tools will adopt GitOps as being one more set of principles that they apply. Like Argo rollouts and Flagger, right? Kind of like, hey, notify me that there is a rollback, right? Kind of just apply the principle to whomever that fits into whatever you're doing. And because realistically, there are thousands of different scenarios of different tools where that can be applied.
And knowing that the tool is built around GitOps principles would actually give me confidence in it. The same way, like when I hear about a tool doing, I don't know, CI/CD, whatever nowadays, and then they tell me, oh, it's actually Kubernetes based. And that totally gives me like a big plus. That's like, okay. So it's gonna be custom resources and all these things. Yeah, cool. I like that. I don't know what this tool exactly does, but I know that it will be a familiar way to run it and manage it and whatever. And it just feels good. And when I would know about a CI tool that does GitOps, is already like a CD tool, whatever that does GitOps, would give me a level of confidence that that I know I can look into a Git repo and so on. So it's it's not going to be a black box that does its database things and whatever.
Exactly. Okay, man. Let's close this up.
Yeah.
GitOps is my summary is GitOps is awesome, and we are suffering a lot at the same time.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and Tarin shared in the chat. We have a page about GitOps like a bit of a collection of things that we have written, including a little mini book by Ian Mayall about the basics, covering very nicely the basics of GitOps. So whoever is new to this, just please check it out. And and really big thanks for having me. This was a really nice chat, Viktor. That also kind of moved my thinking forward on quite a few things. Now I just need a project to try the new ideas out.
Okay, then send the articles list whatever, and then
it's in the chat. It's in the chat. So it's
cool. Okay, thanks everybody, and see you when we see you.